certainly archaeology can't prove that Jesus was resurrected, but it can either lend credence or cast doubt on whether or not Jesus was buried in a particular spot. So that's a story in and of itself, because in the 19th century, a lot of people did not believe that the Holy Sepulchre was on the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. But archaeological evidence over the course of many decades shows that it probably is the site, that the tradition is probably true. So there are ways in which archaeology can do a lot to paint the picture for us of what things actually looked like back in those days.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project. Always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by another special guest, Andrew Lawler. Am I pronouncing it right? Lawler?
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I sometimes mess up names. So I'm like, hopefully I get his name right. For those who don't know who you are, just give them a little background about yourself.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a journalist. Primarily, I write about archaeology, and I write for National Geographic, for Smithsonian, and mainly my job is to travel around the world, go to archaeological sites, and write about new finds.
That's awesome. And there was a recent article that we shared of yours that was really popular on our site, Church Unearthed in Ethiopia, that was posted by the Smithsonian Magazine. What kind of motivated you to write that article?
Well, I was at a meeting in San Diego, a meeting of archaeologists back in December, and I was speaking with one of the archaeologists, a man who works for Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and he said, hey, we've got a pretty cool find in Ethiopia. And I said, really? What is that? And he said, we've got the oldest church in sub-Saharan Africa. So that intrigued me, and he was about to publish a paper on this subject. So as soon as that was published, I was able to get an article out and really reveal to readers what is an extremely important find in the history of Christianity.
That's helpful. And one of the reasons this, I think, was so popular when we posted it on our Facebook page and people were sharing the article was that we deal a lot with this whole aspect of Christianity being a white man's religion in our organization. And so it kind of combated the narrative that Christianity started solely with Europeans. And so it was helpful in that way to highlight the rich African Christian history that is present.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, we got to keep in mind that Christianity, of course, began in the Middle East, not in Europe. And it really didn't reach Europe until for really a couple of centuries before it really began to spread. And in the meantime, and we didn't really understand this until the past few years, it's clear that the empire of Aksum, which was an empire around today's Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, became a very important center for Christianity at a very early time.
That's really, really helpful. When you were first researching this archaeological find, what stood out to you the most? What intrigued you the most about it?
Well, I think like most people, I assumed that Christianity had spread from the Middle East and went to places like Rome, where the church began to develop, and maybe with some churches, of course, in the Middle East. We have all the letters from Paul to various cities in Turkey and other areas in the Middle East. But what I didn't really understand was how the empire of Aksum, that is today's Ethiopia, played a really key role in the spread of Christianity. So let me explain. So in the 3rd century, that would be the 3rd and 4th century. So say around the time of 313 AD, 300 years after Jesus, we know that the Roman Empire embraced Christianity when the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. Before then, it had been illegal off and on, and Christians, of course, had been persecuted. But after that point, it became pretty quickly the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we know a lot about the history of that. What we didn't know was what was happening outside of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire at that point included most of the Mediterranean, that is a good deal of Southern Europe, Northern Africa, as well as the Middle East. But there's also this area along the Red Sea and in that part of Africa that is the Horn of Africa that sticks out toward the Arabian Peninsula that actually was a very important area in the spread of Christianity. And if you want, I can go into some detail about that.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so what happened was this, that in that time of the Roman Empire, the Romans were trading with places as far away as India. So you had ships that were going from the Nile and transferring their cargo over to the Red Sea. And then you could sail down the Red Sea, past Arabia, and all the way to India. And that's where they were getting cotton. They were getting all kinds of timber and jewels and spices, and all kinds of trade goods were moving up and down that area to feed the Roman Empire, and also to feed the Indian subcontinent as well, which was a very important civilization in that time. So right in between India and Rome lies the Horn of Africa, what we today call mostly Ethiopia and Eritrea, that area. And in that time, the people that lived there managed to take advantage of the trade that was being created between the Roman Empire and India. They became middlemen. So they owned ships, they had ports, they were able to spread the goods back and forth, and it became a very, very wealthy empire that included not just Africa, but also spread to the Arabian Peninsula, to what is today Yemen and parts of southern Arabia. So this is an empire most people don't know much about. And archaeologists have only recently begun to unearth evidence of what was going on. So to come back to our question of Christianity, what happened in this 4th century, so right around the time that Constantine was legalizing Christianity in the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity reached as far as Ethiopia, because this church that was recently uncovered by archaeologists has been dated to about the middle of the 4th century. So that's around the time of that Constantine died, which was in the 337 AD. So at the time that Christianity is just beginning to kind of get its legs, if you will, in the Roman Empire, it's also spread to Ethiopia. And we already have people there that are building churches. Now, this find is really spectacular. And this is Johns Hopkins University in conjunction with an Ethiopian group. They've been working for several years in a small town outside of Axum. Now, Axum was the capital of the Aksumite Empire. So about 30 miles outside of town, what is today a small village called Betasamati, the archaeologists managed to uncover remains of a basilica. So a basilica was used in Roman times as a place to trade. So it was basically like a mall, a long, skinny building. And Christians adopted that for their churches. They adopted that design to build churches. Well, here we find this design all the way, this is more than 1,000 miles away from Rome. We find it in the middle of Ethiopia. So it was an astounding find to find evidence of a Christian basilica. And they know it was Christian because there were inscriptions that talk about Jesus, that show images of the cross. And what's really interesting is that not only did they find remnants of Christian worship there, but they also found evidence of carved objects and rings that show bulls that clearly are evidence of the religion that was there prior to Christianity, the indigenous religion of the Ethiopian highlands. So we have here Christians living with people who are still practicing their traditional beliefs, but are beginning to embrace this new religion which has come from the outside. Now, the big question is, how did Christianity get to the middle of Ethiopia at this early date? And this is a question that archaeologists are still trying to understand. There are a couple of theories. One theory is that you had people that were, you had monks and missionaries that were moving down the Nile River and then coming up the Nile all the way into Ethiopia. The other possibility is that they were traders, missionaries who were catching a lift with the ships that were moving down the Red Sea, and that from there they were making their way up into the highlands and bringing Christianity to the locals. So we still don't know which is true. There's an old Ethiopian legend of a particular monk who arrived from the Middle East to bring Christianity. It's long been considered a myth, but it's certainly possible now, given this physical evidence we have, that very early on you have Christians who were journeying to this far spot in order to bring Christianity. Now, subsequently, the Aksumite kingdom became actually a fully Christian empire, and really next to the Roman Empire, the largest and most powerful Christian empire. And it lasted for several centuries. In fact, even today, nearly half of the people in Ethiopia are Christians, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. They have people that live on the roof of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. They're represented in Jerusalem and have been for many, many centuries. So they're really one of the oldest strands of the Christian faith that exist anywhere in the world.
And that's extremely helpful for us to know. As you were writing and researching for this article, what other things kind of stuck out to you?
Well, I think the biggest surprise is that of course, now we have physical evidence that Christians were there in Ethiopia in this very early time. So I think what surprised me most was that while I thought that the Roman Empire is really where Christianity began and where it spread, that actually it was happening in other parts of the world, particularly south of the Mediterranean area in Ethiopia. So I think what's fascinating here is that we get a picture of a larger world than just what we might get from, say, the letters from Paul. He was traveling in the Roman Empire. But now we know that there were people that not long after Paul, a century or two after him, were traveling even longer distances, possibly as far as India. In fact, we know that there were missionaries that were moving as far as Sri Lanka, which is an island an island country off the coast of India. So we know that Christianity was spreading. And what this tells us is not just about the spread of Christianity, but also about the spread of a global trading network. Christianity would have gone nowhere if there weren't ways for people to travel from point A to point B. One of the reasons why Christianity became so successful in the Mediterranean was because the Romans provided peace and security. They provided roads, they provided seaways, they provided ports. There are ways to go from point A to point B without being attacked by pirates or destroyed by storms. These were always threats, of course, but what's amazing is that this network stretched all the way to India. So it gives us a bigger picture of the milieu in which Christianity was born. That we tend to get a skewed version because in the New Testament, as I mentioned, we see the letters from Paul, who's traveling around in what's now Turkey in the Middle East, all the way to Rome, maybe further beyond that. But we don't really get this picture of what was happening outside of that area. And that's why archaeology is providing us with a whole new vision of how Christianity spread.
How long did it take them to get to this? How long did this dig take?
Well, the dig has been in process for about a decade now. So it's very difficult to figure out where to dig. Aksum is the capital, as I mentioned, and that has been excavated by archaeologists over the years. But the archaeologists, including Mike Harrower, who is the one who led this expedition by Johns Hopkins University, they discovered some evidence of an ancient mound or tell, as they call it among archaeologists. So basically it's a hill, but it's a hill that's built because humans over time have lived there. And as your pots break or as your house falls apart, you just cover things over and you build on top of it. So it eventually creates an artificial mound or hill. And this is what makes it possible for archaeologists to determine where you want to dig. So Mike Harrower discovered this tell that had been known for some time, but nobody had really done extensive digs there. So they began to excavate. And to do that takes a long time. You have to very slowly take off layer by layer because archaeology is a process of going back in time. So you have to destroy the layer at the top and get down lower and lower and lower until you can find the bottom of the settlement. So it took them quite a number of years to get to that level. And then they had to be very careful in excavating this building, this basilica, because there are lots of very small finds, coins, and other things, which you can't use a bulldozer, and even using a shovel sometimes is too much. You have to use a brush or even a toothpick to be able to find these small objects, which can really give us important clues as to how people were living and how they were worshiping, what they believed, what they ate, what their lives were like. So this is a very time-consuming process. So this discovery was many, many years in the making.
That's awesome. I know you've recently written an article for National Geographic on some discoveries in Jerusalem. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. In the cover story of the December 2019 issue, we had a story about underground Jerusalem. So this was a story looking at the massive excavations that are going on now in Jerusalem, and kind of the intersection of religion with science and politics in what is clearly the most contested place on Earth. So I spent a lot of time going into the tunnels that are being dug, exposing. I'll give you an example. One of the big discoveries that's happening right now, it's quite controversial, is just south of the old city of Jerusalem in what is called the City of David, which is the original city of Jerusalem on a little hill just south of the old city. Archaeologists have been digging underground, exposing a street that was built probably at the order of Pontius Pilate, who, of course, I'm sure your listeners will all know, who was the head of Judea for the Romans back in the 1st century AD, at the time of Jesus. And so at the time that Jesus was alive, he apparently ordered the construction of a massive monumental street that went from the sacred pool of Siloam, which is also mentioned in the New Testament. There's the story of Jesus curing the blind man with mud from this pool. This street went all the way from this pool all the way up to the Temple Mount, where at that time the Jewish temple stood. So it's a very massive project that was built with enormous stones, with these steps that led up, that pilgrims and others could have followed on their way up to the Temple Mount. Now, what's controversial about this project is that it's being dug underneath what is primarily an Arab neighborhood. And the Arab residents, who are mostly Muslim, have complained that the digging is causing damage to their homes above. So it's a very tense situation, because on the one hand, you have this desire by archaeologists to expose this ancient street, but you have people living above who are complaining about damage to their homes in what is a very contested part of what is probably the most contested city on Earth. So I spent some time both with the archaeologists below ground as well as with the people who live above ground to determine, what is going on here and what does this project say, not just about the past, but about the present.
Yes, I can imagine. I think about when people start doing construction work in the US and it bothers neighborhoods and the frustration that ensues. So I imagine that it is similar frustration in those parts that we experience here in the US when people are doing projects around residential areas.
Yeah, that's right. So Jerusalem is a very densely packed place. I mean, lots of people living in a small space, and the city has traditionally been divided into quarters. So you have an area where the Jews traditionally have lived, an area where the Muslims live, and a Christian quarter, along with an area where the Armenians, who are also Christian, of course, live. So it's a very complicated place because you have people with very different beliefs that are living in a very small area. The old city of Jerusalem is just maybe less than a mile square. So within that space, you have not just people who are practicing 3 different religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. They also have some of the most holiest places in their religion there. For Christians, of course, that's the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre is, by tradition, the place where Jesus was crucified, where he was buried, and where he resurrected. That's all contained within the Holy Sepulchre today. For Jews, of course, there's the Western Wall, which is the remnant of the vast platform that was built by King Herod to hold the Jewish temple that was destroyed about a generation or so after Jesus. And then you have Muslims who, in the 7th century, so that is 600 or 700 years after Jesus, they arrived in Jerusalem and turned the Temple Mount area, which had been largely abandoned by Christians, into their sacred site. So the Dome of the Rock, which you've probably seen pictures of, that golden dome, sits at the center of what they call the noble sanctuary. There's also a mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it is considered the 3rd holiest site in Islam. So Jerusalem is fascinating, not just because it has holy sites, but because it has some of the holiest sites for 3 of the world's major religions.
Yes. For those who are listening, I think your work is very important as far as highlighting how these archaeological connect to culture and their importance and relevance. For those who may be listening and have this, most people, when they think of archaeology, they think of something that they're totally not interested in. How would you encourage those who are listening that have kind of not paid attention to archaeology in the past? How would you admonish them to think about it going forward?
Sure. Well, about 150 years ago, when people first started to go to the Middle East, when Europeans began to go to the Middle East and archaeologists went to dig, really their focus at the time was on finding the biblical sites, being able to use science in order to show where biblical events took place. And it's called biblical archaeology. So many people may not know that archaeology in areas like Jerusalem really began with Christians who went there in order to either find biblical places or even to prove the Bible true. Now, archaeology is a little more sophisticated now because I think many people probably understand that science can only do so much to prove belief. Certainly, archaeology can't prove that Jesus was resurrected, but it can either lend credence or cast doubt on whether or not Jesus was buried in a particular spot. So that's a story in and of itself, because in the 19th century, a lot of people did not believe that the Holy Sepulchre was on the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. But archaeological evidence over the course of many decades shows that it probably is the site, that the tradition is probably true. So there are ways in which archaeology can do a lot to paint the picture for us of what things actually looked like back in those days.
That's extremely helpful. How can people get in contact with you and get connected to the work you're doing?
Sure. Well, I have a website, www.andrewlawler.com, that has all of my stories up online that you can read, including the most recent National Geographic article, which is called Under Jerusalem. Also, the article I did that we talked about on the Ethiopian church that was recently uncovered is on that website. And I have loads of other articles, some about biblical archaeology, some about other topics as well. And I welcome people to sign up, and you can sign up for my newsletter and just really stay in touch with what's going on in archaeology, because understanding our past is, I think, really critical for knowing who we are and who we want to be.
Awesome. That's extremely, extremely helpful. And I appreciate your time. For those who you remember, you can stay connected to Jude 3 by searching Jude 3 Project on all social medias, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You could go to our website. Above me, you will see jude3project.org. You can get our curriculum through Eyes of Color, take our online course, or get merch there. Thank you so much again, Andrew. This has been a rich conversation. I'm so thankful to have you on the Jude 3 Project. Until next time, remember, we're helping you to know what you believe and why you believe it.